Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Brendan Hauser with EVOQ. I got a great podcast today with James Allan. He's a student finishing up his degree and has long-term goals of a PhD in sports science. And we talk about volume, intensity, the human side of an athlete. What's really the difference between the 1%, not even the 1% pro, the local athlete who's always winning versus the rest of us. And I think there's a lot that comes up from focus, the amount of volume, how we balance all this. We talk about Zwift to real life racing. There's a lot that unfolds with James, and I just really enjoyed the conversation. So hopefully you get something from this to improve your training just a little bit. And the sports psychology side of things is always evolving and very interesting to hear some of the people that he's working alongside. So he's calling in from South Africa, which is really awesome. And shout out to Tristan. You'll hear about who that is in the podcast. Good luck with your training racing, everybody. We'll talk to you soon. Enjoy the pod.
Yeah. It's man, you bring up a really good point, I think, about the person side of the sport, and that's something that we should also jump into, because I feel more than ever that gets lost a lot. And I've probably seen that change the most over the past like 6 or 7 years. But we can get into that. That's an interesting one too.
Yeah, it is. And it's something that we get taught so much and we get hammered on. But I think when you leave and go into practice, you still forget it. Yeah, it's definitely something that is worth exploring in terms of, the multiple facets of it, and why people forget, or scientists forget about that aspect. I think that's, the fundamental reason why is obviously the focus on science, but it's still interesting to see how different people forget about it in the different ways and why. And it is an interesting topic.
I think we should actually maybe start there, not to throw a curveball at you, but before we do that, we'll probably just roll from here, because I think it's an interesting startup. Let's do a quick intro for people who might not know. Who are you and what are you doing for work?
Okay, cool. So currently I'm still a student. I'm a postgrad student at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. I'm a qualified sports scientist. As I say, chasing my postgraduate at the moment. I'll be finishing that up this year, and then I'll most likely continue my academic career and path in sports science. At the moment, I'm specializing in performance sport, but I'll likely go into exercise physiology next. So that's sort of who I am in a nutshell. I try and involve myself as much as possible in the cycling industry in South Africa, working with some pro teams. We're privileged in Stellenbosch that in the summer, a lot of the pro teams from Europe come here and train and have their summer camps. So I've worked with a few of those athletes when they were over here, mainly the XCO guys from Switzerland. And but that's me. I also cycle. Marathon is my forte. Tried gravel, but I'm not so good at it, not so fond of it either. So I'm just trying to stick to marathon at the moment.
What do you like more about marathon than gravel?
For me, I think it's a technical aspect. If you look at gravel, it's obviously very technical, but in South Africa and in the Cape, especially since moving here, we're privileged. These trails are, they're immense. We've got thousands of kilometers of trail networks here. Obviously with the Cape Epic here, they're all really, really maintained superbly, and they make for really good days out. You can do 160 Ks, no problem, on trails, which is really fun. And for me, I did the gravel. I also struggled with a knee injury, and when I did do the gravel a couple of years ago, that knee injury progressed and kind of put me out the sport for a while. So maybe it's just a bad psyche or psychological issue that I have with gravel in general. But for me, I think as I say, marathon, it's also a lot bigger here in South Africa. I think gravel is still on the up in South Africa, but in terms of established cycling in South Africa, I'd say marathon is definitely the dominating force.
So this is crazy small world. Did you say Stellenbosch is where you live?
Yeah.
Do you know Tristan?
Tristan Nokia or?
Tristy's Planet on Instagram.
What's his surname?
I'd have to actually look it up. So this is hilarious. I was in Florida and two guys jump on my wheel, and I didn't know them, so I'm gonna gas it real quick, and so hit the gas, and at the stoplight we caught up, and we were like chopping it up. I'm like, where are you guys from? And this guy says to me, oh, I'm actually an engineer on big boats. I'm from South Africa. And I'm like, no way, dude, this is sick. So we like chopped it up a couple times. We kept in touch on Instagram. And when you're telling me about these mint trails, he sends me videos, and he said, I hope you know the invite to come to South Africa is open. And I said, oh, dude, don't offer that to me because I will be there. And so I'm a very planned person. I've already planned trips for next year, and I was talking about 2026. He lives in Stellenbosch, so I already warned him I cannot survive on a mountain bike. I said, so can we shift to gravel riding, which I don't really love. I'm a road guy, but the images that he posts are so crazy. And I don't know anybody in South Africa, so I might be hitting you up and be like, yo, James, let's go ride. Yeah. And I might have to, you can bring your mountain bike out on some gravel tame roads.
Yeah, that would be amazing. I mean, look, as I say, marathon is the biggest, in my opinion, the biggest form of cycling. But I definitely think gravel is coming up, especially in South Africa. There's a whole bunch of new series being introduced to the sport here. And a lot of the guys are planning to specialize in it. It seems a lot of the marathon guys. It seems like an easy switch for the guys here in South Africa to switch from the marathon into the gravel. And we've got the mountain ranges around Stellenbosch. If you go on the other side of them, you get the Klein Karoo and the Karoo, and there that makes for some really, really good gravel riding. There's one coming up in October. I'm just looking at my calendar, called the Cedar. You should, if you ever do come around the end of the year, there's a race called the Cedar. It's a gravel race. It's a really long one, which is 240 or so, and then 140 as well. But the pictures, when I did it the first year, it was snowing on the Cedarberg, and the pictures are just insane. It's like guys
crazy
mud with snow on them. It was phenomenal.
So was it snowing because it was such high altitude? Or when I think of South Africa, and this is probably a really dumb statement, I don't imagine snow. Do you get a lot of snow there?
Yeah, it's just the look, I'm not a geographer, so they could probably offer you a better explanation. So it's not particularly high because it's just, kind of inland from the coast down to Cape Town. But as far as I can understand, because of the mountains, the cold air comes up from the cold ocean, being the Atlantic, and it kind of pushes up and causes snow on these mountains. So even now, if you go towards, there's a small town outside Stellenbosch called Franschhoek, you'll see mountains. I mean, the mountain tops full of snow. So there is snow.
That's wild.
It's very cold, and there's quite a bit of snow.
His last name is Bellingham.
Bellingham? No, I'm not familiar.
I'll send you his profile. Yeah, super cool person to follow, everybody. Tristy's Planet. I'm gonna hit him on and be like, okay, man, I just did a podcast. This is what are the chances of that? It's so cool.
Yeah, we did a bikepacking trip.
Yeah, I don't know about bikepacking. I'm like, let's go ride 5 or 6 hours and I'm good. I'll be sleeping in a place with a roof, and go get some good food. And I'm not a big adventurist on the bike. It's like I just like to ride mega, and that pretty much is my shtick. But so, okay, let's actually talk about the first thing. So everybody in this podcast, I like to give a little preview. We were talking about training volume and the difference between the 1% athlete and the 99%. I'm going to let James explain that in a minute. And then also depth of performance. And this is really what excited me when James messaged me of a topic, because the sort of tagline to that is it's more than just physiology, and we'll get more into that. But just before we started recording, James had said, hey, I've listened to the podcast before, and I asked him, hey, which ones resonate with you the most? He said, I really like listening to other coaches because this is sort of the path he's going down, but I also like listening to the athletes because as a coach and with a science background, sometimes we forget the human side of the sport. So I think I echo that a million times. Tell everybody, what do you mean when you say that? What part of the human side do we miss sometimes as coaches?
Yeah, and I think they'll actually lead nicely onto the next topic of, the kind of like the depth of cycling performance and the determinants thereof. And what I mean by that is obviously, through sports science, we heavily focused on physiology, heavily focused on biomechanics, some anatomy and so forth. And one of the other studies that we do is sports psychology. And, we get nailed from first year, to focus on that these are human beings that you're working with. And of course, it's the obvious. It really is. And I think that's why some people just overlook it in general. They forget that, athletes are still human. They still do human things. And when you look at, the determinants of cycling performance, one of the big ones is the individual dimension, which includes, physiological features, morphological, emotional, and cognitive. And those are human emotions, and that plays a role in performance at the end of the day. So you can have someone who's so well physiologically peaking and, biomechanically in tune and everything is optimized. But at the end of the day, if their emotional state and their cognitive state isn't up to scratch, they likely won't perform on the day that you want. And as I say, it's easy to forget, because as a physiologist, you look at I've actually noticed this in myself more and more, is when I look at someone performing, like now at the moment with the Olympics, it's great. You watch these athletes and you start to look at people as physiological processes, and you forget that there's actually a person busy performing those, and it's going on in a human body. And it's this whole interconnected system that I think needs nurturing by the coach as well. It's not just the coach's job to make them peak physiologically, but also to assist them in their emotional state and their cognitive state on the day. And there's various ways to get, your athlete to perform emotionally and be in a cognitive state that is performance driven. We have a phenomenal lecturer down in Stellenbosch called Professor Grobler, and he specializes in sports psychology, or sports psychometry, I should say. And he's seriously opened my eyes to what the world entails and how much of a difference it actually can make in terms of their psychological well-being and cognitive state as well. And also how trainable these features are. You'd be shocked to find out how trainable they are. Like in terms of, we obviously understand how to train athletes physiologically, but a little bit less explored is the psychological training that you can do, or the cognitive training that you can do with these athletes. And as I say, I was introduced to that world quite recently with Professor Grobler, but it is intriguing to put a whole new meaning towards that. It's not just an athlete, it's a person at the end of the day,
And I think to add some real world application of this, from James had sent me some notes that he had, and under your emotional cognitive features, if someone's like, what actually are those? We're talking about mood, levels of anxiety, your self-confidence, your ability to manage pain, focus, and then just cognitive function. And I think, another aspect to this that people might be able to relate even deeper on is when we went through the pandemic and a lot of people were racing on Zwift, it took out the anxiety of being on the start line around other people. You were in your pain cave, your basement, living room, wherever, and you went and just had to push watts. And I know many athletes, and I follow a lot of people when they're going through the Zwift, what I would call era. I know there's less people racing there now because real life racing is back. When they went to transfer this to the road, it was surprising how many people forgot the human element and getting ready in the parking lot. And now you're in a foreign area, and now you're racing people that you don't know, and it's not just an avatar. And it really brought to light all of these other little pieces of racing that Zwift really made a lot more of. Understand the watts, understand the power-ups, understand the courses, and you could kind of get these bullet points. Whereas everyone who's done a bike race knows how many millions of other little things are happening. And so it's that's an interesting tidbit. And I think your other comment on what's the job of the coach to get them to perform, I feel I am a huge cheerleader, but I think there needs to be, I need a better word. I've never really thought about this, but I'm very realistic. So if someone's not performing well, I don't try to sugarcoat the performance, but rather break down what's going wrong and how do we remedy this? And is it that big? Is this, string of bad workouts, where does this fall in relation to the events coming up? And that's one comment that people have made to me of, you helped me start believing in myself almost more than I thought I could accomplish. And I'm saying that as an athlete. Like, my coaches have always, I think back to my second coach, Jason Hillemeyer. He made me understand that if I don't believe that I can do something great on the day of the race, before I go to the race, I have a very little chance of doing that. And I think just our mind is so powerful, and the emotional, cognitive side of this sport is so underlooked and undervalued, that you need people around you that can help lift you up, because all of us hit a point in time when we're not feeling so good. And so, yeah, I think that's huge.
Yeah, it is. It is interesting. And, one of those things is that, as you said, with the Zwift racing and so forth, and then you come to a real race and you're like, what's going on? There's real opponents. And it's a known fact that the opponents and their response to the racing, as it would be, will actually affect the response, your psychological response as a person, and how you perform on the day. So what I mean, why I would bring that up is I find it crazy that, as I say, you can be peaking in all other aspects of your body and physiology, but during the race, something that an opponent does and how they interpret it will actually affect your performance, in the sense that you are now perceiving something differently to the rest of the people. And it's just, as I say, that wraps around that athletes are still human beings,
Mm-hmm. Should we go into the next topic then, that you said kind of threads into this, the determinants of cycling performance, how it's more than just physiology, and you can go a little bit deeper on beyond the things we kind of just hit on?
Yeah. So obviously we've discussed, and this is from a paper. I'm not sure, maybe you could put the reference to the paper somewhere in the link, or
sure,
something like that.
Yeah.
I don't want to quote anyone's work without putting the source there. But this is from a paper that I read, and I was wondering, obviously, what makes, because if you look at athletes in the top, 5, 10 of a really high-end race, if you look at them, they're all physiologically quite similar, and I take that with a pinch of salt. It's obviously my opinion. But if you look at them physiologically, they're in a similar state, especially if you're comparing, apples to apples. And it got me wondering. Obviously, we understand aerodynamics quite well, and we're starting to understand more things and implement more things. And rolling resistance in mountain biking is starting to be tested a lot, and so is, as I say, aerodynamics and all of these, I can call it almost mechanical or external controllables, are starting to be tested and worked with. And I sat there wondering, well, what else is there that we might not, or I might not be looking at in my athletes or clients or whoever I might be working with, without talking to a coach or an athlete. And I found this paper. It's titled "A Review of the Dimensions and Features Regulating Performance in Elite Cycling Competitions." It was a great review done by these authors, and they broke it down into the individual dimension, which is obviously the person, so physiological features, morphological capacities. So we understand that if you want to be a hill climber, if you're smaller, you will likely be faster up a hill. And then they looked at emotional and cognitive features, and then other individuals, like, for instance, that more cycling did not, or more, how can I say it, more competition did not correlate to better performance, which I found quite interesting. Because a lot of people say, race to train. And they said that actually doesn't really affect performance to that much of an extent. And then the tactical dimensions, which they mentioned, drafting features, and then also interpersonal features, which is actually how people work together in the group. And obviously the study was done on road cyclists, so a lot of these are applicable more to road cycling. But I think as science in mountain biking starts to progress, we start to look at, in a marathon race, maybe there is marginal gains in wearing, for instance, aero socks, or even at the gravel race, we saw them with, aero helmets and even almost disc wheel. So we're starting to understand that it's not just road cycling where these benefits happen. And Yeah, as I say, the paper is fascinating. It opened my eyes to what else there might be. It's not just physiology. There's a lot more to it than just focusing on physiology, especially as a coach. We used to see, skills coaches as separate coaches as it would be compared to a physiological coach or a normal performance coach. And it shows you that there's a lot more to it than just these two things, especially in mountain biking, that there might be more.
I think even another way too, especially when talking to newer athletes as they start to go to these races, a very interesting email is the week of the race. Hey, how you doing? What are you thinking for this weekend? And just opening up what an athlete is thinking about is so interesting. The answers are on such a wide spectrum. You'll get everybody who's spending so much energy thinking about whether they should run 30 or 32 road tires, to somebody who has a more, wide open tactics kind of thought process going on. Someone else is thinking about tinkering with nutrition. It just, as you said, there's this paper, and just talking to athletes makes us realize how we all view these competitions so differently. And it's really interesting. What's your thoughts on the race to train? What surprised you about that? Maybe what did you think the answer would be, and why do you think they didn't see that correlation or causation, whichever would be?
Yeah, when you mention that, two things come to mind. Firstly, for instance, Vingegaard at the Tour de France this year. Obviously, with his crash, he didn't have many races leading up. Pogacar did. And we saw Pogacar's performance was good. Was it because of the races? Probably not. Is it because he was stronger? Probably yes. Was he having a really good Tour de France? Yes, no doubt. But I think it shows that Vingegaard, even though he did crash out, he still had a phenomenal race. Crash out of the other race before that and had bad start to his season. He still had a phenomenal race. So I think it indicates to us that, while racing is important to maintain your performance, I don't think it's vital to cause a great performance on, let's say, your A race. Whether you did or didn't have a load of races leading up to it, I think it's not going to determine how you will do on that A race. So if you put C, B, and D races before, it might not correlate to a better A race.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a balance, with so many things in training. I think the things that an athlete can get out of those, let's say, early races before their A races, especially if they're newer, is just getting your timing down. When do you have to be there? How long does it take you to get the number pinned on? Get all your stuff together on the bike. Are you warming up? Some people show up 20 minutes before and they run out of time, and it's just they haven't rehearsed what a bike race is. But I agree with you. I don't think that the effort necessarily makes you as strong as you need to be for the next big race. Like, they don't just all build on each other like training does. I look at it more as you do the training, and the expression of that training is your results at these bike races. And yes, do we need to have some type of intensity that a bike race will elicit from us? I would agree with that, because I think some people that go to a race, and we could even say a gravel race. I was having a conversation with Tobin Ortenblad the other day, and we talked about the first 40 minutes of a gravel race, that a lot of people just aren't prepared for how much full gas there is. So if you don't even maybe mentally know that's coming, you could be dropped in the first 40, 30 minutes, 20 minutes from the front group. So, but yeah, it's I don't think the answer is always just go race. And I think you need to we know why we do all these different types of training, and we need to do that to make ourselves step on the start line with our best chance possible. So that's interesting that came up. I like that. What about, you had mentioned you kind of hit on these. Anything else on the tactical dimension of that paper besides the drafting, and maybe anything like the interpersonal features of cooperation and things like that?
Well, I think, I don't know, it's widely known, but something that did take me back was the extent to drafting and how much of an effect it actually has on your power numbers. So that was quite interesting on the reduction in drag that you actually get, and also the distance. It says, I think it doesn't say here, but I was reading up to 5 meters, you're still getting benefits, and even up to 10, which I found that was interesting. A lot of people think you have to hug the wheel, which actually ends up being probably more dangerous and beneficial for inexperienced guys anyway. And so that was something from the tactical. Most of that I think is quite well known. Still, I think the tactical dimension as well, I think, comes down to race experience, which could link to more races might be better in that sense. But I also think it comes down to the experience of maybe the team that's behind you. I was chatting to another guy. He used to work for the Canyon women's team, and when he joined, he said that he noticed just from driving the car behind them that there was a lot of benefit to be had if they just made simple changes. For instance, dropping their head position most of the time in the pelotons, and it would impact their drafting efficiency or their aerodynamic efficiency. And I thought that was quite cool. And I was actually looking on LinkedIn the other day of how they tested some of the helmets for the tour with Team Astana. And it was just, as I say, a lot of these things I've also noticed, on the same thing. A lot of the teams hold their cards really close, and it's understandable. But I think a lot of the times they're kind of getting at the same thing from different angles. And I was chatting to a professor the other day, and he said if they just, obviously they won't, because it's not conflict of interest, but it's their IP. They won't share it. But he says if it was an open field and all the scientists from all the different teams just shared what they were currently experimenting on and currently looking at, he says the sport would probably progress a lot faster in a lot of the senses. So that's kind of, totally different conversation for another day. And then the interpersonal features is the competition. So when I was reading the paper, they mentioned stuff like, how well the group works together. And it's not just obviously because you get better aerodynamic efficiency and drafting efforts. It's the fact that they said that a smaller group working well will be more beneficial than a larger group not working well, which might seem obvious, but if you think about it logically, they basically equated it to the group with a bigger group that's not working as well, and not cooperating with each other. They had a less chance of actually winning the race than the smaller group that worked well together. And they also linked it not just towards the saving on the energy expenditure, but also the psychological and the, how can I put it into better words? It was down to the self-confidence as well in the riders in that group. They kind of were psychologically sussing each other out too much because they weren't working well together, whereas the smaller group was, had a better chance of winning, which I found quite interesting.
It's like the sociology of the group. It's 100%. I think anybody that's been in the break in like a road race, when you have maybe 9 guys and there's always a couple people not pulling through, not pulling their weight, people get grumbly. You have 4 or 5 and you're just ripping and everybody's usually committed. And that's interesting. Did you, going back to the drafting aspect, did you happen to see that thing a couple years ago? Maybe, I can't remember when this was, showing how there's also draft from when a car is behind a rider in a time trial. Yeah. And the more stuff you had in the car, the more draft they were getting. It was actually creating this little bubble and pushing the rider a little bit.
I have heard about that. I have heard about that.
It's so interesting. The images, and I can't remember what they tested. And then they had some team cars have the bike sideways as opposed to, front and back, which would be more aerodynamic, which would be worse for drafting in that case. But the science, I don't think everybody's going to share their secrets. It would be great if they did. But there's plenty of coaches that don't. I've reached out to somebody before because I had an interesting strength question. And I heard them talking about it. And they politely said, "Oh, that's something you should ask your coach." And I said, "Oh, it's so cute, man. I respected you. I thought, okay, never mind. That's how you want to be. All good." So, some people are just not about that. But what's, before we move on to the next topic, any last thoughts about this one?
No, I think we covered it quite well. as I say, I think the takeaway is just to not look at cycling performance as just a physiological or, how can I optimize myself by aerodynamically, but also to look at it from other facets. There's some stuff that you might think has no impact, but it most likely will.
Yes, agree. Love that. So the next one, I'm just curious about the tagline. We're going to talk about training volume and the intricacies of it, but what is the difference between the 1% athlete and everybody else, the 99%?
So I think this is not clickbait, but a great heading. Because I think
it's 2024. It's got to be a little clicky, or people just don't pay attention.
Yeah, the social media thing, I don't understand, but yeah. So I think this is something, if we had the answer to this, we'd solve a lot of we'd have really high-performing people everywhere. But I think what I meant by that is, looking at, and it ties into the topic that we just discussed, what is the difference between the guy who keeps on winning, or that 1%, and the rest in the field? And I think it takes myself, who's been racing for a while, like kind of, as you grow and as I study sports science and start to learn more about it, you start to look at it and break it down and say, yeah, there is obviously a big difference between the guy up front and the guy at the back. And what is it? And what is changing between, whether it be an elite race or non-elite race? What is the difference?
What do you see, even from your first statement of, if we had this solved, we'd have a lot of better performing athletes? What do you think is the issue? Is it the amount of volume? Because I hear two different things. Like, there's that statement, but then I have an answer in my head of, and let's talk more amateur, because that's who's going to be listening to this podcast. We do have some pros that listen, but the amateur athlete, the bike races that most of us are going to, there's usually 5 to 7 riders, let's say, in a 60-person field that really have a good shot of winning, and then everyone else is hoping to maybe, somehow they pick up a really surprising, awesome result.
Yeah.
Go in on those two a little bit more.
Yeah, so I think, I'll do the typical scientific thing and say it depends. It depends on the person.
That's cycling, though. A lot of times it does just depend.
And as a true scientist would say, it depends. But I think when we discuss, especially amateurs, so I've worked a lot with amateurs, and I've met a few pros, and it's striking me, what strikes me the most is the amount of volume, and that's kind of specifically what I'm trying to unpack at the moment. The amount of volume that these either pros or amateurs do, because you get amateurs that do quite a lot of hours, and you get pros that actually do quite a little bit of hours. And I was quite shocked to learn, I worked at the Cape Epic with 2 athletes. And the hours are, I won't give much more, but the hours that some of them, that the one who was working, he's got a full-time job, so he can't put in hours like a paid athlete would. And, he still is a very high-performing athlete from France. And you kind of look at how many hours he's doing, and you go, hey, but then what is it? Because if he's not doing excessive amount of volume like some of the other pros are doing, what is it? Is it just his training age? Is it what training he is doing? Or what might it be? But then if you chat to other physiologists and other coaches, they really nail on the volume thing, especially I've noticed in road cycling compared to mountain biking. You get professional athletes doing 30 plus hours. I was shocked to see the lifetime Grand Prix athlete, Brian Johnson, I think is his name, I think he rides for Felt. Am I getting that correct? His volume of hours that he did leading up to Unbound, I mean, he did a 40-hour week. That's. Are
you talking about Keegan?
No, not Keegan. It's Brian Johnson. Yeah, guy's obsessed with aero as well.
Interesting.
I think he got a top 10, definitely a top 10 finish. I'm not sure what position. But even his hours, but even Keegan's hours, I mean, you look at their hours, it's huge. But then you get some guys who are in that field, which we might not know about, or see or know their data, but, they're training 20 hours a week. So it's definitely a topic of, I think, more exploration of how much volume is enough, and also what volume are we looking at? Is it just zone 1, zone 2 of a 5 zone? Or, are we spending a lot more volume in the other zones as well, and kind of not hiding it in amongst all that volume, but hiding it in amongst all that volume? Because if you look at it as a percentage, you're spending 10% in like zone 4 or zone 5, and you're training 30 hours a week. That's actually a lot of zone 4 and zone 5. But then you get some guys who are training 15 hours a week who are spending 10% in that same zone, and it's just not that much. And I think that's something that needs more exploration. There are some guys from America that are very much so doing research into it and understand it a lot better than I would. But I just thought that was an interesting topic to see how some pro athletes are training, 30 plus hours, but others are training under 20 and they're still competing with each other. And it's at why.
Mm-hmm. I do, to what you alluded to. I think it's the focus of the training. I think especially when we talk to amateurs, I think, if we're talking about World Tour pros, they have things dialed with their coach and they've been doing this for a long time. But the lack of focus in a lot of athletes training of, even if they decide they're going to do 20 hours and they spend 8 of it, a literal 8 hours coasting around, like doing some group rides where they just smash for a little bit, and maybe when they go smash, they get like 3 minutes of really hard work in, which I don't think is truly the right amount. And then they're coasting and kind of dilly-dallying a lot. And so now this 3-hour ride is like, what did you really reap from that? How much more optimal could you make that? And now there's always someone who says, oh, but that's my social ride. I want to go have fun with my friends. Cool, great. There's a place for that. But if someone's truly talking about becoming as fast as they can, I think there's a lot of misaligned time in training, so that then it's, do you add more or do you just make what you're doing better? And if someone said, hey, James, how do I find my optimal volume? Where do you go with that?
Yeah, maybe we can have a podcast in a couple of months and I can answer that better. Because as I say, this is something that's on my mind a lot at the moment. And I'm truly trying to solve for it and asking the right people the questions. So, I couldn't give you a straight answer right now. And I guess it depends on how much time you have, because, athletes with more time, might get a better opportunity at training because they're training more. But I think also, tied to that is the element of recovery and time. So when we talk about amateur guys who might have a full-time job, they unfortunately are time-struck athletes. That's just, life. They have to pay the bills somehow, and it's not racing that pays their bills. So, these guys are going to their 9 to 5 and then fitting in some training here and there. And something that I think is undervalued in sports as well, especially by amateur athletes, is the amount of recovery that is actually needed for training. And the more volume you do of training, the more volume of recovery you need, and optimizing that recovery as well. So I think some, pro athlete who's training 30 hours plus, he's spending a lot of his time recovering as well. And it's not just, getting a better night's sleep. It's eating the right stuff. There's a whole bunch of recovery modalities that these guys are doing. I know some athletes that go for massages 3 times a week, which is technically a recovery modality. But also it takes it's the psychological aspect of that high volume that I think pro riders have learned to respect in a sense. They respect that if their volume of training is much higher, they have to look after their body a lot better, and not just physiologically or physically, but also emotionally and mentally and psychologically. So, how much volume is enough? I think whatever volume you are able to use should be enough. Bear in mind that your goals are a representation of that amount of volume. So you can't, aim to win a Cat 1 race with 10 hours a week, in my opinion. I don't think that's enough. But if you've got 15 hours a week, okay, now we can start to talk. But once again, then your recovery will really have to be on key too.
Yeah, I think another very broad brushstroke is how much volume can you absorb that you're using that you're not tanking yourself. There's people that go from 10 hours and then they're going to do 16. And sure, you can go do a 16-hour week, but can you do 3 in a row and actually absorb that stimulus on your body? Probably not right away. I think that's the one misstep is there's just so many people trying to do crazy volume without the years of base. And I don't mean base from like a base season, but just most athletes do not start doing 800 hours a year. And I have seen a handful of people that I've talked to just looking through power files and giving them tips that all of a sudden, now that we have access to everyone's training and people know how much everyone else is riding, they try and ramp it up way too fast. And that is a great way to burn out and just not progress as an athlete. So I would not trying to wave a red flag to people, but just be smart about it. If you want to get to your highest high, you need some patience in this sport, and don't try and rush to be what your local, hitter's doing. They've probably been doing it longer than you. You brought up training intensity and in some bullet points of reliable methods for measuring that. What do you think are good ways to track the intensity that you're doing?
Yeah, so this is something that I'm working on at the moment. And I was chatting to another colleague that I work with about this. He did his master's in, he was comparing one zone model to the next and one training method or periodization method to the next as well. And, this is something that if you look at something like, it's not cycling related, but if you look at team sports and, strength and conditioning specialists, a lot of them, especially in South Africa, I can't speak for abroad, but a lot of them are actually quite, I could say, unsophisticated when it comes to tracking load. And they use quite generic models that don't truly monitor load to the physiological extent that I think it should be looked at. I think there's a lot more to load management than just looking at intensity and volume. I think it overlaps with how much volume at that specific intensity. And I think this is something that triathletes like Blumenfeld, they seem to get it quite well. They said, I was watching a video about him, and everyone knows that he's absorbing a lot more volume than people previously thought an athlete could do. And I think something about that is his sports scientist ability to manage that load and that internal load as well. And this is something, as I say, I'm busy working on it, so I probably will have more answers by the end of the year kind of thing. But I do think looking at each intensity and, the physiological demands of each zone in whatever model you might be doing might be a better way to manage the load that you're putting on your body than just looking at it as a generic intensity model, because, for instance, on the popular training site or training software, Training Peaks, we get TSS. And if you look at TSS, it of course it gives us a indication of the load being placed on your body for that workout. But does it explore which system is being taxed more, which energy source is being taxed more? Because we know that if you're in zone 2, you should be able to do it a lot longer. And I think if you recover from that zone 2 ride properly, you'll be able to do a lot more than you actually think you can. And being able to manage each zone and its load, I think is something that, I personally want to be able to understand better. And I think coaches and athletes would gain a lot of insight into how they should be recovering from, the load in each, physiological system and each energy source.
And to make that, if someone's not familiar with TSS, training stress score, if you rode 14 hours of zone 2 and had about 700 TSS for the week, you could get the same I'll say quote unquote the same 700 TSS by doing 7 1-hour time trials. Two very different weeks. Obviously, your body's going to feel extremely different after each one. And so one thing I'd like to add on as a takeaway or maybe action item for any self-coach athletes or athletes that are trying to understand the training loads that they're putting on, also think of it in terms of the sessions that you're doing. If you're labeling your rides, which you should always do in Training Peaks, so you can look back, and you see that you're doing 4 high intensity, like if it says threshold, VO2 max, and you have way more than doing basic aerobic work, you're riding too hard. And this is like the most basic thing that you could do. But there are riders that are so, I don't want to say obsessed, they just do intervals way too often. And I think just take a step back and look at what you're doing. How are you going to continue to do this? Is this sustainable for 6 months, or is this sustainable for 4 years? And everybody has a different answer of how long they're in cycling for. But if you're trying, again, to be the best athlete that you can be, you need to look long-term as well as short-term. And I think that's an easy thing to miss when we're new and we're pumped up and we've got all the training files that we want to complete. And it's just easy to kind of go down a rabbit hole of smashing way too often.
Yeah.
You brought up heart rate versus power. What's your thoughts there?
Well, we know that your heart rate responds to the amount of, put it plainly, heart rate responds to the amount of power that you exerting on the pedals. So one is a reflection of the other, I think. I could say. And a lot of people, obviously, especially at amateur, sometimes don't have power meters. So we understand that power is like the gold standard now for when we prescribe training. But what about for monitoring training? We know that some zone models were actually descriptive and not prescriptive in nature when they first came about. And we've now obviously made them prescriptive. So we're using these zone models to prescribe athletes using power or heart rate data. And I think it takes kind of some reflection to go, okay, we're using power now, and that's a gold standard. Are we still looking at heart rate and the heart rate response and actually looking what that might mean? Because the thing that I think reflects as well is that heart rate it's a continuous thing, especially if you've got a Whoop or a Garmin watch or whatever it might be measuring your heart rate. It's a continuous thing from your bike to your bed. And I think monitoring load using heart rate, of course, is flawed in the sense that it's not the most accurate nowadays. But we also, I think, there's no need to undervalue it still. I think it's still a good metric to look at and to use when monitoring load, not necessarily for prescription, but maybe for description.
What do you think about when an athlete says, my heart rate wouldn't really come up during this session? Am I fit or am I tired?
Yeah, I had this the other day. I was sick. And I looked at my watch and I was like, okay, that's why I'm not feeling good. And I think you got to look back at what you were doing, look at the environments that you're in. I was traveling, so it was obvious to me, okay, I'm getting sick. And the next day I woke up with a fever and I was pretty sick. So I think they also tie in, when you are tired or are fatigued, the likelihood of you getting sick does go up. So if your heart rate is dropping to a point that when you're riding like where you normally would up the hill that you normally do, and your heart rate, normally 140, now all of a sudden it's really low and you're not feeling good, then I think you need to look at yourself and be like, okay, this might be a warning sign, an early warning sign as well. And that's kind of what I meant by using heart rate for what it was meant to be used for, not just overlooking it. Because when I look up, how to give myself training programs, it comes up with a whole bunch of power stuff and all of that stuff. And it undervalues heart rate nowadays.
And I think what you said was, and how do you feel? Look at the heart rate and how do you feel? I've had athletes say, I just couldn't get my heart rate up today. I said, well, is that a bad thing? They said, well, doesn't that mean I'm tired? I said, well, couldn't you be fit? And I just throw questions at them sometimes just to see where they're at and thinking about it. Because for me, if I'm doing VO2 max intervals and I'm super fresh, I hate that my heart is jumping out of my chest. Whereas if I still feel good and it's 7 beats lower, that feels way better in the session. But now to your point, if I'm at that 7 beats lower, same point, and I'm not pushing the watts, it's very easy to say, oh man, I'm a little tired. This is probably not the session to do today because I just don't have the watts to make any physical change in my body. So I think just some common sense too goes a really long way with training metrics. It can get, I don't think Whoop is a great thing for reasons of people say, oh man, my Whoop is telling me how tired I am. I said, how do you feel?
Yeah.
Like, are you really
Yeah.
psyching yourself out because of this algorithm on your wrist? Do you not know how you feel? And that's, I think, a bad thing if an athlete can't self-assess themselves, because that's just, you don't need someone telling you, and especially if you feel bad and then someone else is telling you that you feel bad, you really don't feel good. So
Yes.
what's, I think, the last point that you had mentioned is kind of open-ended: tools and techniques with things coming out. What do you see coming out, or what are some thoughts on those?
Yeah, well, for the load management and maybe intensity management as well, I'm waiting for it, is the continuous lactate monitor. I think that's going to be, when that comes out, I think it's really going to change the game a bit. I think it's going to be very, very interesting to see how it progresses and what else might come out afterwards as well, because in physiology we learn that so many biomarkers are actually linked to the intensity that you're working at. And I think it's just a matter of time before there's some really smart people out there. I'm learning in my academic journey, some really intelligent people out there, and there's continuous development and growth in stuff or tools coming out. I also think it takes a lot of sifting. We've worked, when you look at some reviews of the reliability and validity of some of these tools, what they claim on the package has its terms and conditions. And I think sometimes you do have to sift a bit to find, good tools and techniques, and you can't just be, all in on one tool and not look at everything. And I'm looking forward to the development of the tools that are coming out, and how we can actually use them to optimize training and also load management, and also, periodization ahead of time.
Where are the continuous lactate monitors at? Like, I was actually just Googling this to see, I'm seeing one like MoLab, but are these out at all, or is this down the road, like years down the road, or how do you see that?
Yeah, so I was listening to a podcast the other day. I can't remember on which podcast, and there was a doctor talking about it. Apparently, they are quite close. They're doing final stage testing. So there's a company in America, I think it's linked or something with one of the universities in America, and they seem to be leading the way with that. It started off as a medical tool for cardiac rehab patients, and it seems that they are going to basically not evolve it, but continue to develop it into a training tool that coaches and scientists and athletes too can use. I know early development and early research was done in China as well. They were on the cutting edge at one of the universities with developing a continuous lactate monitor, which is actually very successful, and they did test its reliability and validity. But I think it'll come out. I'd hate to say, but I think it'll be quite soon. Maybe in the next year, 2 years. I mean, soon is on a spectrum, right? Soon could be 10 years.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too, this article there's a few different ones from like Abbott Labs, a K-Watch. Interesting. Cool.
Yeah. So the one was like a wearable. It looked a bit like a whip, like a band, that you wear.
Mm-hmm.
That was the one, but that was what they call a non-invasive. So it uses some sort of light frequency to measure that, which is a little bit that I would have to read up more about to understand a little bit better. But the one that I did see was it's like a patch, like a diabetic, like the glucose monitor patch, which I did see, which also might not be applicable in the racing scenario, like the glucose monitor. I think it'll turn a few heads in the UCI and so forth.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, more for the amateurs at that point.
Yeah.
Man, this was awesome, James. I appreciate you reaching out again. And any other final words or thoughts on any of this or other ideas?
No, I think, as you say, to kind of, it's sometimes amazing just to chat. I personally love talking about sports science and talking about coaches and athletes and the whole environment of cycling in general. And I think sometimes I annoy some of my friends. So thank you for having me on board to chat. It's nice to have some ears to listen. And it's been great.
That's actually what some athletes say. They're like, I'm so glad my wife is on board with me having you as a coach so I can talk to you and not them about my training. It's like, I'll laugh at that. Everybody, so I'm gonna put your Instagram. I'm gonna put the reference paper link. I will any like website links or Twitter or what else you on where people can follow you.
Maybe I can send you through my LinkedIn as well. You can put that down there, and then just my Instagram. I think that's my main what I mainly use for all my communications.
Well, if you guys have questions for James, hit him up, slide up in the DMs. Good luck with your training and racing, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.